In this video, I'm going to talk about determining the marginal productivity of a resource, and specifically, we're going to be talking about a perfectly competitive resource market. First thing to know is what the heck is a resource market? A resource market is the market for productive resources. So think of a resource input such as steel or labor. These are things that firms will buy and will demand in order to produce their products. So if you recall the circular flow diagram, the circular flow diagram is a simple diagram to help you understand how firms or businesses and households kind of fit together. So firms demand resources, or what we often call factors of production: land, labor, and capital. So they're demanding things like steel and workers so that they can then produce products. So firms supply products, but they demand resources. Okay, and then they sell those products to households. So households demand products, and they spend money in the product market, and then that money becomes revenue for the firms or the businesses. Households supply resources in the factor market or the resource market, right? These are interchangeable terms. And those resources might include land, labor, capital. So think of, the easiest thing to think of is working, right? Somebody who's a worker. And then, so they're suppliers of those resources, and then the firm is the demander. So the household is the supplier of resources and the demander of products, whereas firms are the demander of resources, but the supplier of products. All right, just kind of a quick overview of what resource markets are and how they're different than product markets. So in this worksheet, you're given some information about product markets. I'll maybe just quickly highlight this. It says product market. Okay, so the firm sells its output in a perfectly competitive product market. Now, you may recall that a perfectly competitive product market is where there is a perfectly elastic demand curve for the firm's output, okay? Meaning that you're going to have a demand curve that looks like this for the firm's output, and that the firm can sell all of its output at the same price, which is exactly what it says, where the firm can sell all of its output at the price of $5 per unit. Then it goes on to say, suppose that wages are the only variable input cost, and the firm buys labor in a perfectly competitive resource market. So again, a resource market's the second part, where laborers are price takers or wage takers at $20 per day. So what does this mean? Well, what this is referring to is, in the resource market, the supply of labor is also perfectly elastic, where the firm can buy all of the labor that it wants at that same price or at that same wage. Okay, so again, this is in the resource market for the firm, and this is in the product market. So these are a little bit different. Okay, all right. So we need all that information in order to complete this table. And once we've completed the table, we can go down and we can plot it out on the graph. All right, a couple of terms, actually three different terms, but one of them that should be familiar is, first is the concept of marginal product, or what we often call marginal physical product. And what marginal product is the change in the total output or total product resulting from the employment of an additional unit of a resource input, or in this case, we're going to be talking about labor. So how much does the total output increase when you add, say, 1 unit of labor? And it's calculated change in total product divided by the change in the inputs. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Marginal revenue product is a newer term. This is specific to the labor market or the resource market. And that is defined as the change in total revenue, not production, but revenue, due to the employment of an additional unit of a resource or an input. And that is calculated. There's a couple of different ways to do it. For our purposes, we're going to stick with this, which is the most straightforward. Change in total revenue due to the change in an input. And then the last concept is the marginal resource cost. And that is the change in the firm's total cost due to employing an additional unit of a resource input. And that is the change in the total cost divided by the change in the number of inputs. Okay, and so we're going to be talking about these a little bit more here. And I need to finish my my calculations here, and just as a cheat for us so that we don't have to keep looking up here, we can see that this is the same equation here, this is the same equation here, and this is the same equation here. And these are each measuring something that is slightly different. All right, now once again we've got kind of a bunch of like a word puzzle, or a number puzzle I should say. And let's start off with the things that we know for sure. Well, the first thing that we know is that the price is always going to be the same, because this is a price taker product market. So the price is always $5 regardless of how many you sell. So we can fill all that in. And the marginal resource cost, which in this case is going to be the idea of a wage, it's always going to be $20. So every worker is going to be paid $20. Okay? You don't have to, what the distinguishing factor is you're not bidding up the price of the wage by buying more. The wage is constant because, again, the firm is a price taker. And what we'll see later is, and I didn't quite have this showing here, but what we're going to see later is that there's a demand here, which is going to be the firm's marginal revenue product curve. And that's what we're going to be looking at next. But we don't have that marginal revenue product curve yet. That's going to be this column. So we could actually, in advance, know that the marginal resource cost is going to be, in this case, the supply curve. I'll just maybe put this down here. That's going to be the supply of labor to the firm. And down here, the demand curve for the firm is going to be the marginal revenue product curve. All right, but we'll get to that in a moment. So we've got these two columns sorted out. What we need to do now is fill in the gaps. So the first unit of labor is able to produce 12 units of total product or total output. So the total output at this point is 12. The change going from 0 to 12 is plus 12. Going backwards there. The change going from 12 to 22 when we add a second worker is plus 10. The change from 22 to 30 occurs when we hire a third unit of labor, and that is plus, we're looking at the difference, plus 8. And then if we hire a fourth unit of labor, we're going to increase from 30 to 36 units of output, plus 6. And we go to the fifth unit of labor, we go from 36 to 40, that's plus 4. And when we go to 6 units of labor, adding a 6, we go from 40 to 42 units of output, which is a marginal product of 2. Okay, so the marginal product is the change in the total product due to the change in the number of inputs. Now, we're always increasing the number of laborers by 1, so the division part's kind of unnecessary. Let's go on to the total revenue side. Well, we know that price times quantity gives us our total revenue. So to get the total revenue here, all we have to do is multiply. Well, we don't have any revenue for the first, or for this first row, but for the second row, or the first unit of labor, we have 12 units of output, and 12 times 5 is going to give us $60 in total revenue. When we go to the second unit of labor, the total output increases to 22. 22 times 5 is $110. 30 times 5 is 150. 36 times 5 is 180. 40 times 5 is 200. And 42 times 5 is 210. Now, the marginal revenue product is the additional revenue, the change in total revenue, due to the change in the number of inputs. So what we want to look at is every time that the total revenue goes up due to the additional employment of a unit of labor. So you can see we start at 0, we go to 60 with the first unit of labor. So the first unit of labor has a marginal revenue product of $60. Oops, 60, not 50. So $60. Make that clear. And then we add a second unit of labor. We go from 60 to 110. Well, the change in total revenue is $50. And then we add a third unit of labor. The change in total revenue is $40. When we add the fourth unit of labor, total revenue goes from 150 to 180. That's an additional $30. When we go to the fifth unit of labor, we go from $180 in total revenue to $200. The change is $20. Sixth unit of labor, we go from $200 in total revenue to $210. So the change is, or the marginal revenue product is $10. So marginal revenue product is the change in total revenue due to the change in the number of inputs, okay, or an additional unit of input. Okay. So the rule for deciding whether or not we should employ an additional resource is that marginal revenue product should be equal to or greater than marginal resource cost. Now, this actually should look familiar. In the four market structures, we often talked about the marginal revenue should equal the marginal cost. Well, this is just simply adding another element, and that is the marginal revenue product is the additional revenue that is derived from an additional unit of labor. And this is the additional cost that comes from an additional unit of labor. And so we're basically making sure that the cost is less than the additional revenue. So when we're looking at these two, we've got our marginal revenue product and our marginal resource cost. And I'll highlight these here just to make sure that we're matching our colors. The marginal revenue product is greater than the marginal resource cost all the way up until we get to the fifth unit of labor, where they happen to be equal. So this is the point that we're going to want to stop hiring new workers. So we're going to want to hire 5 units of labor, because this unit of labor, their cost is equal to their marginal revenue product, or stated another way, their additional cost of $20 is equal to their additional revenues. So now what we can do is we can plot these two things. We want to plot, it asks us to plot down here the marginal revenue product and the marginal resource cost. And again, we're going to use green and blue. So looking at marginal revenue product curve, at 0, we can't do 0. But for the first unit of labor, the marginal revenue product is $60. For the second unit of labor, it's $50. For the third unit of labor, it's $40. Fifth unit of labor, I'm sorry, I'm off here. 60, 50, 40 for the third, and 30 for the fourth. For the fifth unit of labor, it's $20. And sixth unit of labor is $10. So this is the marginal revenue product curve. This is also known as the firm's demand curve. So the marginal revenue, the marginal resource cost curve is going to be whatever this column is. Now this column is always going to be the same. It's always going to be $20. So that makes this very easy. Each unit of labor is $20, so it doesn't make for a very interesting graph. That is our marginal resource cost, which is also the supply curve for this labor market, okay, or at least for this particular firm. So how many units of labor are we going to be employing? Well, we see, of course, that the marginal revenue product and marginal resource cost are equal at 6 units. So that is the quantity of labor that this particular firm is going to want to hire. And when you're looking at it on the graph, you can see that on that first unit of labor, this firm might be making, say, $40, $30, $20 of profit, at least on that unit, and then $10, and then on the last one, they're not really making any additional profit. Moving on to some of the questions, I'm going to leave this here. We're also going to be peeking at the questions. So after we've plotted it, the second question says, how many workers, I'm sorry, that's not what it asks. It says, should the firm hire the third worker? And explain. Well, when we look at that third worker, we can say, well, yeah, it makes sense to hire that third worker because this third worker has a marginal revenue product of 40, but their marginal resource cost is only 20. So you say, yeah, well, that particular worker, their cost is going to be less than their benefit. So you would want to hire that worker. So yes, their marginal revenue product, in this case, is 40. Is greater than their marginal resource cost, which was only $20. So you're going to make $20 on that unit of labor. So you definitely want to hire that unit of labor. So the answer is yes. Okay, let's go on to the next question. Should the firm hire the sixth worker? Well, the sixth worker, it looks like marginal revenue product is 10. Marginal resource cost is 20. No, that's not good. So we're actually going to say no, you don't want to hire that worker because their cost is actually greater than their additional revenue. Okay, the additional cost is greater than the additional revenue. So I'm going to say no because the marginal revenue product is only $10, where the $20 marginal resource cost is, of course, greater. So you don't want to hire that particular worker. How many workers will the firm hire? Well, in this case, we're going to hire 5 workers because that is where the marginal revenue product is equal to the marginal resource cost. And both of those numbers are going to be $20. Question number 5. Suppose that the wages paid to labor increase to $20 per worker. How many workers will the firm hire and why? Well, imagine that this column, every number just changed from $20 to $40. And furthermore, you can imagine that this supply curve, or the marginal resource cost curve, increased from $20 to $40. Well, where is that marginal resource cost curve going to hit your marginal revenue product curve? Well, it's at 3 units of labor. And if you look at it here, you would see the same thing. So again, imagine that this whole column, instead of saying $20, says 40. Well, you'd want to be hiring at that 3rd unit of labor, because if this was 40 instead of 20, then marginal revenue product of 40 would be equal to the marginal resource cost of 40. So the answer here is you'd want to hire 3 units of labor, because that is where your marginal revenue product would be equal to your marginal resource cost, and they'd both be at 40. Okay, given that the wages had risen. One thing that you could also keep in mind is that when you're looking at this graph, you're only looking at the firm. But imagine that over here, there's, you've got a little supply and demand diagram for labor. And what happened? Well, maybe there was an increase in the market demand for labor, and that increase in the market demand drove the firm's demand, or the supply curve for the firm, the costs up higher, so that the price was moved up from $20 to $40. Okay, so now it says, instead of changes in wages, suppose that the selling price of the product increased to $10 per unit. How many workers would the firm hire, and why? Okay, so what we would need to do here is effectively double all of these revenue numbers, as well as doubling all of the marginal revenue product numbers. So imagine if we doubled all of the marginal revenue product numbers. Well, that's going to do 2 things. It's going to, one, it's going to double these numbers, but it's also going to shift the demand curve to the right. So it's worth knowing that the marginal revenue product curve is the demand curve that a firm has for its product. So if there's an increase in the selling price of a firm's output, it's going to have an increase in demand for those resources. But we won't shift it on here, but it's worth knowing that this column, if you were to change all those numbers by doubling all of those numbers to reflect a higher price, what you would do is you would actually end up redrawing that demand curve where it's shifted over. Okay, now we don't have enough space to do that. Okay, so if all of these numbers doubled, where would the marginal revenue product be equal to the marginal resource cost of 20? Well, this is the only number that if you doubled it would equal 20. So the answer is 6 units of labor. So you buy 6 units of labor where your marginal revenue product is $20 and your marginal resource cost is also $20. Okay, number 7. It said to plot everything. Well, we already did that. What is the relationship between the firm's marginal revenue product curve and their demand curve for resources? Well, basically, they are the same. The marginal revenue product curve is the firm's demand for resources. So the more money that the firm is able to make selling each individual unit of output, the more willing they're going to be to hire additional resources. And that concludes this tutorial.